There are moments in life when the familiar world seems to shimmer, as if the edges of reality are thinner than we once believed. A clock strikes 11:11 and, for reasons we cannot fully explain, something deep within us stirs. It feels like a whisper at the edge of perception, a reminder that our existence is not confined to the walls of time and space, but connected to a vast design that stretches beyond what our senses can measure. This is where the path of spiritual awakening begins, not as a dogma or doctrine, but as a lived encounter with the mystery coded into the very fabric of existence. To speak of a code that shifts reality is to acknowledge that life is more than random occurrence. Behind the visible play of events lies a blueprint, a resonance, a hidden architecture, shaping our thoughts, guiding our choices and aligning us with experiences that seem both accidental and destined. The ancients called it by many names: divine order, cosmic law, sacred geometry. In today's language, we might call it frequency, vibration, or alignment. But regardless of the terminology, it speaks to the same truth that awakening is not the act of inventing something new, but of remembering what has always been encoded within us. Imagine a seed lying dormant in the soil. On the surface, it appears lifeless, its small shell tucked away in darkness. Yet within it, an invisible script is written: the pattern of roots, the unfolding of stems, the blossoming of leaves. The seed does not learn this plan. It awakens to it. Similarly, spiritual awakening is the recognition that we, too, carry a script written in energy and consciousness. When conditions align, when the soil of our lives is ready, the code activates and we begin to grow beyond the limits we thought defined us. In the hum of everyday life, this awakening often begins subtly. A repeated number on a clock, a recurring dream, a sense of déjà vu so profound it feels like a message. These are not coincidences, but invitations. The pattern of 11:11, whispered about in countless cultures and teachings, emerges like a doorway. Thoth, the ancient scribe of wisdom, spoke of numbers, not merely as symbols of quantity, but as carriers of divine law, portals through which higher realities could touch human perception. To encounter such signs is not to indulge in superstition, but to sense the deeper choreography of existence, reminding us that reality is layered, and that beneath the surface flows an order waiting to be seen. Yet awakening is not only mystical in flavor, it is also profoundly practical. Just as recognizing the pattern in a song helps us understand its rhythm, so too does recognizing the code behind our lives help us move with greater harmony. Before awakening, we often stumble through life as though blindfolded, mistaking the echoes of fear or desire for destiny. But as the veil thins, we begin to perceive threads of meaning connecting our struggles to our growth, our losses to our liberation. What once appeared random or cruel now takes on the form of initiation, a necessary step in the unlocking of our hidden code. This process is not always comfortable. Just as the seed must break open before the sprout can rise, so too must parts of our old selves dissolve. We may lose interest in relationships that no longer resonate. Careers that once seemed vital may suddenly feel empty, and even our sense of identity may crack under the weight of this new awareness. But within that dissolution is the promise of rebirth. Spiritual awakening is not about escape from reality. It is about transforming our perception so deeply that reality itself shifts in our eyes. What once seemed static and unyielding becomes alive, fluid, and responsive to the currents of consciousness. Consider for a moment the image of a pyramid rising from the sands, its geometry precise, its angles aligned with the stars. To the unawakened eye, it is only stone stacked upon stone. To the awakened mind, it is a message carved in light and shadow, a reminder that the human journey has always been guided by codes mathematical, symbolic, and spiritual that connect the earth to the heavens. Within such structures lies the same truth encoded in our own being, that reality is not a flat stage. but a layered dimension where the seen and unseen dance together. When we begin to attune to this, our sense of self expands. We are no longer isolated individuals adrift in a meaningless cosmos. We are participants in a vast symphony, each life a note resonating within an eternal song. This recognition does not require us to abandon the tangible world, but to perceive it differently. The morning sun is no longer merely light. It is the pulse of creation bathing us in renewal. A stranger's smile is no longer trivial. It is the ripple of interconnected souls acknowledging one another across the web of existence. Even suffering, though it cuts deeply, is no longer seen as senseless. It becomes the pressure that awakens the seed within to grow toward the light. The code that shifts reality is not an external mechanism, but an inner key. It is activated through awareness, through the courage to look beyond appearances and question the scripts we inherited from culture, family, and fear. It does not erase the challenges of life, but transforms the way we meet them. And once this code begins to unlock, life itself takes on a new texture. The ordinary becomes extraordinary. The mundane reveals its sacredness, and we begin to understand that what we once called coincidence is in truth the universe speaking in symbols, urging us toward greater wholeness. This introduction is not meant to give answers, but to open doors, just as the first crack of dawn signals a day yet to unfold. So too does the first glimpse of awakening signal a journey both timeless and deeply personal, ahead lie questions of meaning, explorations of symbols, and the challenge of integrating the mystical into the everyday. For now, it is enough to stand at the threshold, to acknowledge that the stirring within us is real, and that life itself is calling us to remember the code written in our soul to enter the heart of. Spiritual awakening is to recognize that the universe is not a random scattering of events, but a woven tapestry in which each thread carries meaning. What seems fragmented at first glance slowly reveals its symmetry, like a mosaic that only comes alive when we step back to see the whole. The phrase "the code that shifts reality" invites us to peer into this design, to sense that existence is not merely mechanical but purposeful, not static but alive, pulsing with patterns that invite us into dialogue. At the center of these themes lies the principle of illusion versus truth. For centuries, mystics, philosophers, and teachers have described human life as a dance with shadows, a play performed on the stage of appearances. We walk through daily routines, convinced that matter is solid, time is linear, and identity is fixed. Yet, with awakening, these certainties dissolve like mist under the morning sun. The solidity of the world is revealed to be a dance of energy. Time becomes a fluid spiral, and identity unfolds not as a single mask, but as a layered being stretching beyond physical form. The code does not change what is, but it changes our vision of it. And by changing our vision, our reality itself transforms. One of the guiding pillars of this awakening is the recognition of interconnectedness. Like strands in a web, every life, every choice, every thought is linked to the greater whole. This is not a poetic metaphor, but a lived truth, one that quantum science and ancient mysticism alike whisper in unison. When we awaken to this, we realize that the boundaries separating us are thinner than we imagined. A stranger's grief reverberates in our chest. A friend's joy lifts us unexpectedly, and even the silent presence of a tree becomes part of our inner landscape. This awareness reshapes the way we live, for to harm another is to tear at the web that sustains us, and to uplift another is to weave beauty into the design we all share. Another core concept woven into spiritual awakening is the language of symbols and synchronicities. The recurring 11:11 on the clock, the sudden reappearance of a song from our childhood, at the exact moment we need comfort. The way dreams echo our waking concerns in strange yet precise metaphors, all of these form part of the code. They are reminders that life is speaking to us, constantly, not in words but in patterns, offering guidance if we are willing to pay attention. The unawakened eye dismisses these as coincidences. The awakened heart recognizes them as conversation. With the infinite, the code also reveals itself through cycles, a truth that echoes in every corner of existence. The moon waxes and wanes, the tides rise and fall, seasons bloom and wither, only to return again. Our lives, too, move in cycles of growth and loss, of expansion and contraction, of clarity and confusion. Spiritual awakening helps us see that these cycles are not obstacles, but teachers. Just as winter prepares the ground for spring, our moments of darkness prepare us for greater light. The code inscribed in reality does not seek to punish us with hardship, but to shape us, refine us, and guide us toward the deeper strength hidden within. Central to these ideas is the role of awareness itself. Awareness is not simply noticing. It is the light that activates the code. Without awareness, the patterns lie dormant, as meaningless as letters scattered on a page. With awareness, the letters form words. The words form sentences, and suddenly a message emerges. This is why many traditions describe awakening as remembering. The truths of existence are not newly invented when we awaken, they were always present, written into the fabric of reality. What changes is our ability to see, to connect, to interpret, and to act in alignment with what we discover. The teachings of Thoth, often invoked in the mystery schools, emphasize this. Alignment. Thoth did not present truth as abstract knowledge alone, but as a lived wisdom encoded in mathematics, geometry, and language. His voice reminds us that the universe is structured not only by matter but by meaning, and that to awaken is to learn how to read this structure with both heart and mind. In this sense, awakening is not a flight into fantasy, but a discipline of attention, a training in perceiving the hidden architecture of reality. Yet another guiding theme is transformation through paradox. Awakening invites us to embrace opposites, light and shadow, joy and sorrow, finite and infinite. The code is not a straight line, but a spiral. Moving us deeper precisely through the tension of contradictions, we come to understand that suffering and liberation are not enemies but companions, that the breaking of old identities is the doorway to discovering the true self, and that death in its many forms, whether of a relationship, a belief, or an egoic pattern, is not the end but the threshold to renewal. The awakened soul does not seek to erase paradox, but to live within it, to let the tension of opposites generate wisdom and resilience. As these themes unfold, they bring with them both liberation and responsibility. To awaken is to realize that we are not passive spectators, but active co-creators in reality. Our thoughts, emotions, and intentions ripple outward into the web of existence, shaping outcomes in ways both subtle and profound. This does not mean we control reality with the flick of a thought, but it does mean that we participate in its unfolding. The code that shifts reality is not a magical trick, but a profound reminder that the universe responds to the frequency we carry, and that our alignment with truth shapes the reality we step into. To grasp these core concepts is to glimpse the architecture of awakening. It is to sense that beneath every moment lies meaning, that beneath every struggle lies a seed of growth, and that beneath every fleeting event lies a timeless pattern guiding us toward remembrance. Spiritual awakening is not a single event, but a continuous unfolding, a dance of awareness, deepening into ever wider circles of truth. Stories have always been the vessels through which humanity transmits its deepest truths, long before the written word. Myths, allegories, and sacred parables carried within them the essence of wisdom that logic alone could never contain. To truly approach spiritual awakening, the code that shifts reality, we must step into the landscape of story. For symbols and narratives are the language through which the infinite speaks to the finite. They bypass the rigid walls of rationality and seep into the soil of the soul, awakening remembrance at a level far deeper than thought. One such story is the ancient allegory of the mirror. Imagine a vast, cosmic mirror shattered into countless fragments, each shard scattered across the dimensions of time and space. Each shard reflects a piece of the whole, and each human life is such a fragment. Most people, seeing only their shard, believe themselves to be separate, alone, and incomplete. Yet the awakening comes when the shard begins to shimmer and recognize itself as part of the greater mirror. When the fragments align, the face of the divine becomes visible. Once more, this is the code, the realization that individuality is not isolation but participation in a larger reflection. The mirror does not demand that we abandon our shard, but that we learn to see through it into the greater unity it reveals. Another symbolic narrative emerges from the myth of the labyrinth. In many traditions, the labyrinth is not a prison but a pathway, a spiraling journey inward toward the center of truth. Each turn seems to lead us away from the goal, only to bring us closer by a path we could not foresee. Spiritual awakening is much like walking. This labyrinth, confusing at first, filled with reversals and uncertainties, yet ultimately designed to bring us into the heart of our own being. The code inscribed within the labyrinth is that every detour has purpose. Every apparent setback contains hidden wisdom. The walls are not barriers but guides, ensuring that we pass through the lessons needed to emerge whole. There is also the allegory of the firefly in the dark forest. The awakened ones are like fireflies, small lights flickering in the vastness of shadow. Alone, each light seems insignificant, but when seen together, they create constellations, maps through the darkness. The code of awakening is not only personal but collective, for one light awakens another, and soon the forest itself becomes illuminated. This is why the journey cannot be hoarded or hidden. It must radiate outward. To awaken is to become a beacon, not only for oneself but for those still stumbling in the night. The synchronicities, often described in awakening experiences, are themselves symbolic narratives written by reality. Consider the recurring vision of 1111. At first, it may appear as nothing more than digits on a clock, but within the awakened imagination, it becomes a gateway, a cosmic appointment, a subtle nudge from the universe. Numbers, symbols, and repeating patterns are the alphabet of the code. They invite us to step beyond the literal and into the symbolic, to treat life itself as a sacred text unfolding before us. Each synchronicity is a verse, each moment of déjà vu a hidden stanza, each dream a parable. Those who awaken learn not to dismiss these experiences, but to read them, to discern the deeper story being told through their lives. Thoth, the ancient guide of wisdom, is often pictured as the keeper of this symbolic library. He is said to have recorded the secret laws of the universe, not in language that fades, but in symbols that endure across ages. The emerald tablets, attributed to him, speak in riddles and imagery, designed not to explain but to awaken, for symbols are keys, not answers. They do not give us the truth directly, but open the doorways through which truth may step. The narratives of awakening are less like instructions and more like invitations, beckoning us to engage, to interpret, to embody. Even modern lives carry symbolic weight when seen through awakened eyes. Emma, who reached her 78th Conscious 1111 activation, moved from being a recipient of signs to becoming a transmitter of them. Her story itself is allegorical, a reminder that the student eventually becomes the teacher, that the one who follows synchronicities eventually becomes the synchronicity for others. In this way, ordinary human experiences transform into mythic patterns. Your struggles, too, are not merely personal, they echo archetypes that countless souls have walked before you. To awaken is to realize that your story is part of the great story, that your personal trials carry within them the structure of initiation, growth, and transformation. The symbolic narratives also point to the paradoxical nature of awakening. In the tale of the phoenix, death and rebirth are inseparable. The ashes are not the end, but the necessary ground for a new life. In the Hindu imagery of Shiva's dance, destruction and creation are one movement. In the Christian symbol of the cross, suffering and transcendence intersect in a single point. These stories remind us that awakening is not a path of avoidance but of integration. To shift reality is to accept both fire and ash, both birth and death, as sacred stages in the eternal dance of becoming. Not thus, the deeper narratives of awakening do not simply entertain us with myth. They decode the language of existence itself, revealing that reality is not a random sequence, but a story offered in collaboration between the human and the divine. Every symbol, every synchronicity, every myth points us back to the same truth. We are not passive characters in this drama, but conscious co-authors shaping the unfolding plot. It is one thing to speak of mirrors, labyrinths, and phoenixes. It is another to live their lessons when the alarm clock rings, the bills arrive, or when grief and uncertainty cast their long shadows across daily life. Yet this is where the essence of spiritual awakening, the code that shifts reality, must ultimately reside, not only in the realm of cosmic metaphors or symbolic patterns, but in the lived fabric of human existence. Awakening that cannot be embodied in the marketplace, the household, the intimate conversation, or the solitary reflection remains incomplete. The code does not dissolve reality into dreamlike abstraction. It sharpens it, deepens it, and calls us to live more fully within it. To integrate awakening is to approach life as though every encounter were a verse in a scripture written specifically for you. The difficult colleague at work becomes not merely an irritation, but a mirror revealing patterns of reaction that can be transmuted into patience or compassion. The sudden illness is no longer only a medical obstacle, but also a symbolic teacher, urging you to examine the alignment of your lifestyle with the wisdom of your body. Even the humblest experiences waiting in line, walking through the rain, sharing a meal becomes stages where the awakened soul practices presence, for the awakened state is less about fleeing the ordinary and more about infusing the ordinary with the extraordinary light of awareness. Reality shifts not by dramatic escapes into higher dimensions alone, but through subtle, continuous attunements to truth. When you notice repeating numbers, dream patterns, or the synchronicities that line your path, you have a choice: dismiss them as coincidence or receive them as invitations to recalibrate. If you receive them consciously, your daily life begins to align with a rhythm larger than your personal desires. Decisions that once felt heavy become lighter because they are supported by this unseen current. You may find that opportunities arrive at uncanny moments, relationships shift with strange precision, and inner guidance becomes as clear as spoken instruction. This is the code at work, shaping the tangible world through the intangible frequency of consciousness. But integration requires responsibility. Awakening is not a free pass into bliss, nor a guarantee of exemption from hardship. On the contrary, it heightens sensitivity to the world's suffering and increases the call to act with integrity. When Emma transitioned from receiving synchronicities to becoming a transmitter of them, her life did not grow simpler. It grew more demanding. Her energy began to affect others, and with it came the responsibility of stewardship. Similarly, when you begin to radiate awakened presence, others will be drawn to it, and their transformation will be catalyzed by your field. This is not metaphor, it is observable. Friends may confide in you more deeply. Strangers may feel inexplicably safe around you, or entire groups may find cohesion when you are present. The code integrates itself by weaving your life into the lives of others, turning individual awakening into collective resonance. The implications ripple into the wider systems of society. Imagine a workplace where even a handful of individuals embody the awareness that every challenge is both practical and symbolic, every conflict both external and internal. Such individuals naturally diffuse tension, inspire creativity, and foster environments of trust. They shift the culture not by imposing ideology, but by embodying presence. Families, too, are transformed when one member embraces the awakened code. Old generational patterns begin to dissolve. Cycles of unspoken trauma are interrupted, and children grow up seeing models of consciousness that normalize empathy, authenticity, and inner balance. Even on the global scale, integration has profound implications. The so-called Great Awakening described in mystical traditions is not some cataclysmic event imposed from the outside, but the gradual accumulation of these personal integrations, multiplied across millions. When enough individuals choose to honor synchronicities, balance inner polarities, and embody symbolic truths in their daily actions, humanity's collective field shifts. Economic systems reorient toward cooperation rather than competition, education begins to emphasize wisdom over mere information, and medicine reconnects with a holistic view of body, mind, and spirit. These shifts may seem ambitious, but they are the natural consequence of many individuals decoding reality simultaneously. Yet integration does not require perfection. Awakening is not about becoming superhuman, but fully human. It does not demand that you extinguish anger or grief, but that you learn to listen to them without being ruled by them. It does not insist you abandon ambition or desire, but that you anchor them in service to the greater whole. The code is forgiving, cyclical, patient. It allows you to stumble, repeat lessons, and begin again as often as needed. What matters is not flawless execution, but conscious participation. To live the awakened code is to recognize that every moment offers another chance to embody it. Real-world application might begin with the simplest of practices, pausing when synchronicity strikes, writing dreams in a journal, reflecting on repeated life patterns, or asking in silence, what is the deeper meaning behind this? Over time, these small acts cultivate a perception that sees beyond surfaces. The difficult boss reveals lessons in leadership. The financial struggle unveils hidden talents. The heartbreak becomes an initiation into love that transcends possession. Slowly, the world around you transforms not because it changes fundamentally, but because you perceive its hidden architecture, and perception is the key to transformation. To embody spiritual awakening, the code that shifts reality is to accept life as a sacred dialogue, where reality speaks not only in facts but in symbols, not only in events but in synchronicities, not only in matter but in meaning. The practical and the mystical no longer oppose each other, they merge into a single lived wisdom. In this merging, you discover that reality itself is responsive, alive, participatory. You are no longer a passive passenger, but an active co-creator, shaping the script as you live it. Every great story must eventually return to silence, not because the tale has ended, but because the listener has been invited to write the next chapter themselves. So too with spiritual awakening, the code that shifts reality. We have journeyed through pyramids that regulate dimensions, through synchronicities that drive like whispers from a hidden architecture, through symbolic narratives of mirrors and labyrinths and phoenixes. We have translated their messages into the rhythms of daily life, where each breath, each encounter, each unexpected number on a clock can serve as a reminder that existence is more expansive than it seems. Now, the path turns inward and outward at once, into the heart of transformation. At its core, awakening is not a collection of teachings or even an accumulation of mystical experiences. It is a recognition that life itself is the teaching, and every moment is imbued with the invitation to awaken further. The numbers 11 to 11, appearing on a screen or a watch, are not merely symbols but living emissaries of a truth that cannot be confined by digits. They are doorways, invitations, reminders that behind the apparent randomness of reality lies a woven code, a lattice of intelligence so profound that it includes both the birth of galaxies and the quiet thought in your mind this very moment. What shifts reality is not the recognition alone, but the choice to collaborate with this intelligence. To live as though you're in communion with the code is to acknowledge that your inner state ripples outward. that the unseen architecture of your consciousness shapes the reality you perceive. To embrace this is to live with a sense of responsibility. Yes, but also of profound empowerment. You become, in those words, not someone who sees the portals, but someone who becomes the portal itself. This call to transformation is not for the few, nor is it locked in ancient texts meant only for scholars. It is already alive within you, evidenced by your curiosity, by your recognition of patterns, by your willingness to wonder. Spiritual awakening is not the privilege of mystics cloistered in temples, but the natural destiny of every human soul. The code that shifts reality is not hidden in secret chambers, but reflected in every heartbeat, every sunrise, every synchrony that stirs a question in your mind. You are already in dialogue with it, whether or not you call it by name. The path ahead is less about learning something entirely new and more about remembering what has always been yours. It is the remembering that you are not confined to a linear story of birth and death, success and failure, progress and loss. You are part of a cyclical dance, an eternal expansion. A vast symphony of consciousness where your unique note matters each time you honor a synchronicity. Breathe deeply into a moment of recognition, or choose to act from awareness rather than reaction. You amplify your note. The resonance spreads. Others hear it, even unconsciously. Whole communities begin to hum in tune, and slowly the world changes. But this is not simply an abstract vision of a distant future. Transformation begins now, in the smallest of ways. Perhaps it is in choosing to pause when frustration rises, and instead breathing 3 times as if opening the golden corridor that Thoth described. Perhaps it is in writing down your dreams after seeing 11 to 11, treating them as sacred messages rather than idle fictions. Perhaps it is in sharing your story with another, creating a ripple of recognition that reminds them they, too, are part of this awakening. Every act of conscious collaboration with the code magnifies its presence in the world. And yet, the final paradox remains. The more deeply you awaken, the more you realize there was nothing to awaken to. You are always part of this cosmic intelligence, always a living expression of the code. The portals, the synchronicities, the teachings, they are training wheels, scaffolding for the recognition of what you already are. When you finally embody it fully, you no longer wait for signs. You become the sign. Others see in you the resonance of awakening, and they, too, remember. So here we stand, at the threshold of conclusion. Though it is really a beginning, the invitation is simple and infinite. Live as though your every step is part of a grand conversation with the universe. Live as though your very breath carries the wisdom of pyramids and the memory of stars. Live as though each moment of recognition is not a coincidence, but a sacred appointment. In doing so, you do not escape reality, you shift it, shape it, elevate it. This is the transformational call of spiritual awakening, the code that shifts reality. It does not ask you to renounce the world, but to embrace it as divine script. It does not demand perfection, but presence. It does not promise an easy path, but it does promise a true one, where each step draws you closer to the essence of who you are and who you have always been. The question is no longer whether the code exists. The question is, will you recognize it, collaborate with it, and allow it to guide you into the fullness of your awakened being? The answer is written not in these words, but in the choices you make from this moment onward.